The Adventures of Pinocchio, Part 1, by Carlo Collodi. Translated from the Italian by Mary Alice Murray. Chapter 1. Once upon a time, there was a king! My little readers will instantly exclaim. No, children, you are wrong. Once upon a time, there was a piece of wood. This wood was not valuable. It was only a common log like those that are burnt in winter in the stoves and fireplaces to make a cheerful blaze and warm the rooms. I cannot say how it came about, but the fact is that one fine day this piece of wood was lying in the shop of an old carpenter by the name of Master Antonio. He was, however, called by everybody Master Cherry, on account of the end of his nose, which was always as red and polished as a ripe cherry. No sooner had Master Cherry set eyes on the piece of wood than his face beamed with delight, and, rubbing his hands together with satisfaction, he said softly to himself, "This wood has come at the right moment. It will just do to make the leg of a little table." Having said this, he immediately took a sharp axe with which to remove the bark and the rough surface. Just, however, as he was going to give the first stroke, he remained with his arms suspended in the air, for he heard a very small voice saying imploringly, "Do not strike me so hard!" Picture to yourselves the astonishment of good old Master Cherry. He turned his terrified eyes all round the room to try and discover where the little voice could possibly have come from, but he saw nobody. He looked under the bench. Nobody. He looked into a cupboard that was always shut. Nobody. He looked into a basket of shavings and sawdust. Nobody. He even opened the door of the shop and gave a glance into the street. And still nobody. Who, then, could it be? "I see how it is," he said, laughing and scratching his wig. "Evidently, that little voice was all my imagination. Let us set to work again." And taking up the axe, he struck a tremendous blow on the piece of wood. "Oh, oh, you have hurt me!" cried the same little voice dolefully. This time Master Cherry was petrified. His eyes started out of his head with fright. His mouth remained open, and his tongue hung out almost to the end of his chin, like a mask on a fountain. As soon as he had recovered the use of his speech, he began to say, stuttering and trembling with fear, "But where on earth can that little voice have come from that said, 'Oh, oh'? Certainly there is not a living soul in here. Is it possible that this piece of wood can have learnt to cry and to lament like a child? I cannot believe it. This piece of wood, here it is, a log for fuel like all the others, and thrown on the fire, it would about suffice to boil a saucepan of beans. How, then? Can anyone be hidden inside it? If anyone is hidden inside, so much the worse for him. I will settle him at once." And so saying, he seized the poor piece of wood, and commenced beating it without mercy against the walls of the room. Then he stopped to listen if he could hear any little voice lamenting. He waited 2 minutes. Nothing. 5 minutes. Nothing. 10 minutes. Still nothing. "I see how it is," he then said, forcing himself to laugh and pushing up his wig. "Evidently, the little voice that said 'oh, oh' was all my imagination. Let us set to work again." But as all the same he was in a great fright, he tried to sing to give himself a little courage. Putting the axe aside, he took his plane, to plane and polish the bit of wood. But whilst he was running it up and down, he heard the same little voice say, laughing, "Have done! You are tickling me all over." This time poor Master Cherry fell down as if he had been struck by lightning. When he at last opened his eyes, he found himself seated on the floor. His face was quite changed. Even the end of his nose, instead of being crimson, as it nearly always was, had become blue from fright. Chapter 2. At that moment someone knocked at the door. "Come in," said the carpenter, without having the strength to rise to his feet. A lively little old man immediately walked into the shop. His name was Geppetto. but when the boys of the neighborhood wished to put him in a passion, they called him by the nickname of Polendina, because his yellow wig greatly resembled a pudding made of Indian corn, which in Italy is called Polendina. Geppetto was very fiery. Woe to him who called him Polendina. He became furious, and there was no holding him. "Good day, Master Antonio," said Geppetto. "What are you doing there on the floor?" "I'm teaching the alphabet to the ants." "Much good may that do you." "What has brought you to me, neighbor Geppetto?" "My legs. But to say the truth, Master Antonio, I'm come to ask a favor of you." "Here I am, ready to serve you," replied the carpenter, getting onto his knees. "This morning an idea came into my head." "Let us hear it." "I thought I would make a beautiful wooden puppet, a wonderful marionette that should know how to dance, to fence, and to leap like an acrobat. With this puppet I would travel about the world to earn a piece of bread and a glass of wine. What do you think of it?" "Bravo, Polendina!" exclaimed the same little voice, and it was impossible to say where it came from. Hearing himself called Polendina, Geppetto became as red as a turkey cock from rage, and turning to the carpenter, he said in a fury, "Why do you insult me?" "Who insults you?" "You called me Polendina." "It was not I." "You would have it then that it was I?" "It was you, I say." "No." "Yes." "No." "Yes." And becoming more and more angry from words, they came to blows, and flying at each other, they bit and fought and scratched manfully. When the fight was over, Master Antonio was in possession of Geppetto's yellow wig, and Geppetto discovered that the gray wig belonging to the carpenter had remained between his teeth. "Give me back my wig!" screamed Master Antonio. "And you return me mine, and let us make friends," said Geppetto. The two old men, having each recovered his own wig, shook hands, and promised they would remain good friends to the end of their lives. "Well then, neighbor Geppetto," said the carpenter, to prove that peace is made, "what is the favor that you wish of me?" "I want a little wood to make my puppet. Will you get me some?" Master Antonio was delighted, and he immediately went to the bench and fetched the piece of wood that had caused him so much fear. But just as he was going to give it to his friend, the piece of wood gave a shake, and wriggling violently out of his hands, struck with all its force against the dried-up shins of poor Geppetto. "Ah, is that the courteous way in which you make your presents, Master Antonio? You have almost lamed me." "I swear to you that it was not I." "Then you would have it that it was I?" "The wood is entirely to blame." "I know that it was the wood, but it was you that hit my legs with it." "I did not hit you with it." "Liar!" "Geppetto, don't insult me, or I will call you Polendina." "Idiot!" "Polendina!" "Donkey!" "Polendina!" "Baboon!" "Polendina!" On hearing himself called Polendina for the third time, Geppetto, blind with rage, fell upon the carpenter, and they fought desperately. When the battle was over, Master Antonio had 2 more scratches on his nose, and his adversary had 2 buttons missing on his waistcoat. Their accounts being thus squared, they shook hands and swore to remain good friends for the rest of their lives. Geppetto carried off his fine piece of wood, and, thanking Master Antonio, returned limping to his house. Chapter 3. Geppetto lived in a small ground-floor room that was only lighted from the staircase. The furniture could not have been simpler. A bad chair, a poor bed, and a broken-down table. At the end of the room there was a fireplace with a lighted fire, but the fire was painted, and by the fire was a painted saucepan that was boiling cheerfully, and sending out a cloud of smoke that looked exactly like real smoke. As soon as he reached home, Geppetto took his tools and set to work to cut out and model his puppet. "What name shall I give him?" he said to himself. "I think I will call him Pinocchio. It is a name that will bring him luck. I once knew a whole family so called. There was Pinocchio the father, Pinocchia the mother, and Pinocchi the children, and all of them did well. The richest of them was a beggar." Having found a name for his puppet, he began to work in good earnest, and he first made his hair, then his forehead, and then his eyes. The eyes being finished, imagine his astonishment when he perceived that they moved and looked fixedly at him. Geppetto, seeing himself stared at by those 2 wooden eyes, took it almost in bad part, and said in an angry voice, "Wicked wooden eyes, why do you look at me?" No one answered. He then proceeded to carve the nose. But no sooner had he made it than it began to grow, and it grew, and grew, and grew, until in a few minutes it had become an immense nose that seemed as if it would never end. Poor Geppetto tired himself out with cutting it off, but the more he cut and shortened it, the longer did that impertinent nose become. The mouth was not even completed when it began to laugh and deride him. "Stop laughing!" said Geppetto, provoked, but he might as well have spoken to the wall. "Stop laughing, I say!" he roared in a threatening tone. The mouth then ceased laughing, but put out its tongue as far as it would go. Geppetto, not to spoil his handiwork, pretended not to see, and continued his labors. After the mouth he fashioned the chin, then the throat, then the shoulders, the stomach, the arms, and the hands. The hands were scarcely finished when Geppetto felt his wig snatched from his head. He turned round, and what did he see? He saw his yellow wig in the puppet's hand. "Pinocchio, give me back my wig instantly!" But Pinocchio, instead of returning it, put it on his own head, and was, in consequence, nearly smothered. Geppetto, at this insolent and derisive behavior, felt sadder and more melancholy than he had ever been in his life before, and turning to Pinocchio, he said to him, "You young rascal! You are not yet completed, and you are already beginning to show want of respect to your father. That is bad, my boy, very bad." And he dried a tear. The legs and feet remained to be done. When Geppetto had finished the feet, he received a kick on the point of his nose. "I deserve it," he said to himself. "I should have thought of it sooner. Now it is too late." He then took the puppet under the arms and placed him on the floor to teach him to walk. Pinocchio's legs were stiff and he could not move, but Geppetto led him by the hand and showed him how to put one foot before the other. When his legs became flexible, Pinocchio began to walk by himself and to run about the room, until, having gone out of the house door, he jumped into the street and escaped. Poor Geppetto rushed after him, but was not able to overtake him, for that poor rascal Pinocchio leapt in front of him like a hare, and knocking his wooden feet together against the pavement made as much clatter as 20 pairs of peasants' clogs. "Stop him! Stop him!" shouted Geppetto, but the people in the street, seeing a wooden puppet running like a racehorse, stood still in astonishment to look at it, and laughed, and laughed, and laughed, until it beats description. At last, as good luck would have it, a policeman arrived, who, hearing the uproar, imagined that a colt had escaped from his master. Planting himself courageously with his feet apart in the middle of the road, he waited with the determined purpose of stopping him, and thus preventing the chance of worse disasters. When Pinocchio, still at some distance, saw the policeman barricading the whole street, he endeavored to take him by surprise and to pass between his legs, but he failed signally. The policeman, without disturbing himself in the least, caught him cleverly by the nose. It was an immense nose, of ridiculous proportions, that seemed made on purpose to be laid hold of by policemen. And then he consigned him to Geppetto. Wishing to punish him, Geppetto intended to pull his ears at once. But imagine his feelings when he could not succeed in finding them. And do you know the reason? It was that, in his hurry to model him, he had forgotten to make them. He then took him by the collar, and as he was leading him away, he said to him, shaking his head threateningly, "We will go home at once, and as soon as we arrive, we will regulate our accounts. Never doubt it." At this announcement, Pinocchio threw himself on the ground and would not take another step. In the meanwhile, a crowd of idlers and inquisitive people began to assemble and to make a ring round them. Some of them said one thing, some another. "Poor puppet," said several. "He is right not to wish to return home. Who knows how Geppetto, that bad old man, will beat him?" And the others added maliciously, "Geppetto seems a good man, though with boys he is a regular tyrant. If that poor puppet is left in his hands, he is quite capable of tearing him in pieces." It ended in so much being said and done that the policeman at last set Pinocchio at liberty and conducted Geppetto to prison. The poor man, not being ready with words to defend himself, cried like a calf, and as he was being led away to prison, sobbed out, "Wretched boy! And to think how I have labored to make him a well-conducted puppet! But it serves me right. I should have thought of it sooner." What happened afterwards is a story that really is past all belief, but I will relate it to you in the following chapters. Chapter 4. Well then, children, I must tell you that whilst poor Geppetto was being taken to prison for no fault of his, that imp, Pinocchio, finding himself free from the clutches of the policeman, ran off as fast as his legs could carry him. That he might reach home the quicker, he rushed across the fields, and in his mad hurry he jumped high banks, thorn hedges, and ditches full of water, exactly as a kid or a leveret would have done if pursued by hunters. Having arrived at the house, he found the street door ajar. He pushed it open, went in, and having secured the latch, threw himself seated on the ground and gave a great sigh of satisfaction. But his satisfaction did not last long, for he heard someone in the room who was crying, "Cree, cree, cree!" "Who calls me?" said Pinocchio in a fright. "It is I." Pinocchio turned round and saw a big cricket crawling slowly up the wall. "Tell me, cricket, who may you be?" "I am the talking cricket. I have lived in this room 100 years and more." "Now, however, this room is mine," said the puppet, "and if you would do me a pleasure, go away at once, without even turning round." "I will not go," answered the cricket, "until I have told you a great truth." "Tell it to me, then, and be quick about it." "Woe to those boys who rebel against their parents and run away capriciously from home. They will never come to any good in the world, and sooner or later they will repent bitterly." "Sing away, cricket, if you please, and as long as you please. For me, I have made up my mind to run away tomorrow at daybreak, because if I remain I shall not escape the fate of all other boys. I shall be sent to school, and shall be made to study either by love or by force. To tell you in confidence, I have no wish to learn. It is much more amusing to run after butterflies, or to climb trees, and to take the young birds out of their nests." "Poor little goose! But do you not know that in that way you will grow up to be a perfect donkey, and that everyone will make game of you?" "Hold your tongue, you wicked, ill-omened croaker!" shouted Pinocchio. But the cricket, who was patient and philosophical, instead of becoming angry at this impertinence, continued in the same tone. "But if you do not wish to go to school, why not at least learn a trade, if only to enable you to learn honestly a piece of bread?" "Do you want me to tell you?" replied Pinocchio, who was beginning to lose patience. "Amongst all the trades in the world, there's only one that really takes my fancy." "And that trade? What is it?" "It is to eat, drink, sleep, and amuse myself, and to lead a vagabond life from morning to night." "As a rule," said the talking cricket with the same composure, "all those who follow that trade end almost always either in a hospital or in prison. Take care, you wicked, ill-omened croaker! Woe to you if I fly into a passion!" "Poor Pinocchio! I really pity you." "Why do you pity me?" "Because you are a puppet, and, what is worse, because you have a wooden head." At these words Pinocchio jumped up in a rage, and snatching a wooden hammer from the bench, he threw it at the talking cricket. Perhaps he never meant to hit him, but unfortunately it struck him exactly on the head, so that the poor cricket had scarcely breath to cry, "Cree, cree, cree!" And then he remained dried up and flattened against the wall. Chapter 5. Night was coming on, and Pinocchio, remembering that he had eaten nothing all day, began to feel a gnawing in his stomach that very much resembled appetite. But appetite with boys travels quickly, and in fact after a few minutes his appetite had become hunger, and in no time his hunger became ravenous, a hunger that was really quite insupportable. Poor Pinocchio ran quickly to the fireplace where a saucepan was boiling, and was going to take off the lid to see what was in it, but the saucepan was only painted on the wall. You can imagine his feelings. His nose, which was already long, became longer by at least 3 fingers. He then began to run about the room, searching in the drawers and in every imaginable place, in hopes of finding a bit of bread. If it was only a bit of dry bread, a crust, a bone left by a dog, a little mouldy pudding of Indian corn, a fish bone, a cherry stone, in fact anything that he could gnaw. But he could find nothing. Nothing at all. Absolutely nothing. And in the meanwhile his hunger grew and grew, and poor Pinocchio had no other relief than yawning, and his yawns were so tremendous that sometimes his mouth almost reached his ears. And after he had yawned he spluttered, and felt as if he was going to faint. Then he began to cry desperately, and he said, "The talking cricket was right. I did wrong to rebel against my papa and to run away from home. If my papa was here, I should not now be dying of yawning. Oh, what a dreadful illness hunger is!" Just then he thought he saw something in the dust heap, something round and white that looked like a hen's egg. To give a spring and seize hold of it was the affair of a moment. It was indeed an egg. Pinocchio's joy beats description. It can only be imagined. Almost believing it must be a dream, he kept turning the egg over in his hands, feeling it and kissing it. And as he kissed it, he said, "And now, how shall I cook it? Shall I make an omelet? No, it would be better to cook it in a saucer. Or would it not be more savory to fry it in the frying pan? Or shall I simply boil it? No, the quickest way of all is to cook it in a saucer. I am in such a hurry to eat it." Without loss of time, he placed an earthenware saucer on a brazier full of red-hot embers. Into the saucer, instead of oil or butter, he poured a little water, and when the water began to smoke, tack! He broke the eggshell over it, and the contents dropped in. But instead of the white and the yolk, a little chicken popped out, very gay and polite. Making a beautiful courtesy, it said to him, "1,000 thanks, Master Pinocchio, for saving me the trouble of breaking the shell. Farewell until we meet again. Keep well, and my best compliments to all at home." Thus saying, it spread its wings, darted through the open window, and flying away was lost to sight. The poor puppet stood as if he had been bewitched, with his eyes fixed, his mouth open, and the eggshell in his hand. Recovering, however, from his first stupefaction, he began to cry and scream and to stamp his feet on the floor in desperation, and amidst his sobs he said, "Ah, indeed the talking cricket was right. If I had not run away from home, and if my papa was here, I should not now be dying of hunger. Oh, what a dreadful illness hunger is!" And as his stomach cried out more than ever, and he did not know how to quiet it, he thought he would leave the house and make an excursion in the neighborhood in hopes of finding some charitable person who would give him a piece of bread. Chapter 6. It was a wild and stormy winter's night. The thunder was tremendous, and the lightning so vivid that the sky seemed on fire. A bitter, blusterous wind whistled angrily, and raising clouds of dust swept over the country, causing the trees to creak and groan as it passed. Pinocchio had a great fear of thunder, but hunger was stronger than fear. He therefore closed the house door and made a rush for the village, which he reached in 100 bounds with his tongue hanging out and panting for breath like a dog after game. But he found it all dark and deserted. The shops are closed, the windows shut, and there was not so much as a dog in the street. It seemed the land of the dead. Pinocchio, urged by desperation and hunger, laid hold of the bell of a house and began to peal it with all his might, saying to himself, "That will bring somebody." And so it did. A little old man appeared at a window with a nightcap on his head and called to him angrily, "What do you want at such an hour?" "Would you be kind enough to give me a little bread?" "Wait there. I will be back directly," said the little old man, thinking he had to do with one of those rascally boys who amuse themselves at night by ringing the house bells to rouse respectable people who are sleeping quietly. After half a minute the window was again opened, and the voice of the same little old man shouted to Pinocchio, "Come underneath and hold out your cap." Pinocchio had no cap and just stood under the window, and just as he did so, an enormous basin of water was poured down on him, watering him from head to foot, as if he had been a pot of dried-up geraniums. He returned home like a wet chicken, quite exhausted with fatigue and hunger, and having no longer strength to stand, he sat down and rested his damp and muddy feet on a brazier full of burning embers. And then he fell asleep, and whilst he slept, his feet, which were wooden, took fire, and little by little they burnt away and became cinders. Pinocchio continued to sleep and to snore as if his feet belonged to someone else. At last, about daybreak, he awoke because someone was knocking at the door. "Who is there?" he asked, yawning and rubbing his eyes. "It is I," answered a voice, and the voice was Geppetto's voice. Chapter 7. Poor Pinocchio, whose eyes were still half shut from sleep, had not as yet discovered that his feet were burnt off. The moment, therefore, that he heard his father's voice, he slipped off his stool to run and open the door, but after stumbling 2 or 3 times he fell his whole length on the floor, and the noise he made in falling was as if a stack of wooden ladles had been thrown in a 5th story. "Open the door!" shouted Geppetto from the street.
"Dear Papa, I cannot," answered the puppet, crying and rolling about on the ground.
"Why can't you?"
"Because my feet have been eaten."
"And who has eaten your feet?"
"The cat," said Pinocchio, seeing the cat, who was amusing herself by making some shavings dance with her forepaws.
"Open the door, I tell you!" repeated Geppetto. "If you don't, when I get into the house, you shall have the cat from me."
"I cannot stand up, believe me. Oh, poor me! Poor me! I shall have to walk on my knees for the rest of my life."
Geppetto, believing that all this lamentation was only another of the puppet's tricks, thought of a means of putting an end to it, and climbing up the wall, he got in at the window. He was very angry, and at first he did nothing but scold. But when he saw his Pinocchio lying on the ground and really without feet, he was quite overcome. He took him in his arms and began to kiss and caress him and to say 1,000 endearing things to him. And as the big tears ran down his cheeks, he said, sobbing, "My little Pinocchio, how did you manage to burn your feet?"
"I don't know, Papa. But believe me, it has been an infernal night that I shall remember as long as I live. It thundered and lightened, and I was very hungry. And then the talking cricket said to me, 'It serves you right. You've been wicked, and you deserve it.' And I said to him, 'Take care, cricket.' And he said, 'You are a puppet, and you have a wooden head.' And I threw the hammer at him, and he died. But the fault was his, for I didn't wish to kill him. And the proof of it is that I put an earthenware saucer on a brazier of burning embers. But a chicken flew out and said, 'Farewell until we meet again, and many compliments to all at home.' And I got still more hungry, for which reason that little old man in a nightcap opening the window said to me, 'Come underneath and hold out your hat,' and poured a basin full of water on my head. Because asking for a little bread isn't a disgrace, is it? And I returned home at once, and because I was always very hungry, I put my feet on the brazier to dry them. And then you returned, and I found they were burnt off, and I am always hungry, but I no longer have any feet." And poor Pinocchio began to cry and to roar so loudly that he's heard 5 miles off. Geppetto, who from all this jumbled account had only understood one thing, which was that the puppet was dying of hunger, drew from his pocket 3 pears, and giving them to him, said, "These 3 pears were intended for my breakfast, but I will give them to you willingly. Eat them, and I hope they will do you good." "If you wish me to eat them, be kind enough to peel them for me."
"Peel them?" said Geppetto, astonished. "I should never have thought, my boy, that you were so dainty and fastidious. That is bad. In this world we should accustom ourselves from childhood to like it to eat everything, for there is no saying to what we may be brought. There are so many chances."
"You are no doubt right," interrupted Pinocchio, "but I will never eat fruit that has not been peeled. I cannot bear the skins."
So that good Geppetto fetched a knife, and arming himself with patience, peeled the 3 pears and put the skins on a corner of the table. Having eaten the first pear in 2 mouthfuls, Pinocchio was about to throw away the core, but Geppetto caught hold of his arm and said to him, "Do not throw it away. In this world everything may be of use."
"But core I am determined I will not eat," shouted the puppet, turning upon him like a viper.
"Who knows? There are so many chances," repeated Geppetto without losing his temper. And so the 3 cores, instead of being thrown out of the window, were placed on the corner of the table together with the 3 skins. Having eaten, or rather having devoured the 3 pears, Pinocchio yawned tremendously, and then in a fretful tone said,
"I am as hungry as ever."
"But, my boy, I have nothing more to give you."
"Nothing? Really nothing?"
"I've only the skins and the cores of the 3 pears."
"One must have patience," said Pinocchio. "If there is nothing else, I will eat a skin."
And he began to chew it. At first he made a wry face, but then one after another he quickly disposed of the skins, and after the skins even the cores. And when he had eaten up everything, he clapped his hands on his sides in his satisfaction, and said joyfully,
"Ah, now I feel comfortable."
"You see now," observed Geppetto, "that I was right when I said to you that it did not do to accustom ourselves to be too particular or too dainty in our tastes. We can never know, my dear boy, what may happen to us. There are so many chances."
Chapter 8.
No sooner had the puppet appeased his hunger than he began to cry and to grumble because he wanted a new pair of feet. But Geppetto, to punish him for his naughtiness, allowed him to cry and to despair for half the day. He then said to him, "Why should I make you new feet? To enable you, perhaps, to escape again from home?"
"I promise you," said the puppet, sobbing, "that for the future I will be good."
All boys, replied Geppetto, when they are bent upon obtaining something, say the same thing.
I promise you that I will go to school, and that I will study and earn a good character.
All boys, when they are bent on obtaining something, repeat the same story.
But I am not like other boys. I'm better than all of them, and I always speak the truth. I promise you, Papa, that I will learn a trade, and that I will be the consolation and the staff of your old age.
Geppetto, although he put on a severe face, had his eyes full of tears, and his heart big with sorrow, at seeing his poor Pinocchio in such a pitiable state. He did not say another word, but taking his tools and 2 small pieces of well-seasoned wood, he set to work with great diligence. In less than an hour the feet were finished. 2 little feet, swift, well-knit, and nervous. They might have been modeled by an artist of genius. Geppetto then said to the puppet, "Shut your eyes and go to sleep." And Pinocchio shut his eyes and pretended to be asleep. And whilst he pretended to sleep, Geppetto, with a little glue that he had melted in an eggshell, fastened his feet in their place, and it was so well done that not even a trace could be seen of where they were joined. No sooner had the puppet discovered that he had feet than he jumped down from the table on which he was lying, and began to spring and to cut 1,000 capers about the room, as if he had gone mad with the greatness of his delight.
"To reward you for what you have done to me," said Pinocchio to his father, "I will go to school at once."
"Good boy!
But to go to school I shall want some clothes."
Geppetto, who was poor, who had not so much as a farthing in his pocket, then made him a little dress of flowered paper, a pair of shoes from the bark of a tree, and a cap of the crumb of bread. Pinocchio ran immediately to look at himself in a crock of water, and he was so pleased with his appearance that he said, strutting about like a peacock, "I look quite like a gentleman." "Yes, indeed," answered Geppetto. "For bear in mind that it is not fine clothes that make the gentleman, but rather clean clothes."
"By the by," added the puppet, "to go to school I am still in want. Indeed, I am without the best thing and the most important."
"And what is it?"
"I have no spelling book."
"You are right. But what shall we do to get one?"
"It is quite easy. We have only to go to the booksellers and buy it."
"And the money?"
"I have got none."
"No more have I," said the good old man very sadly. And Pinocchio, although he was a very merry boy, became sad also, because poverty, when it is real poverty, is understood by everybody, even by boys. "Well, patience!" exclaimed Geppetto, all at once rising to his feet, and putting on his old fustian coat, all patched and darned, and ran out of the house. He returned shortly, holding in his hand a spelling book for Pinocchio. But the old coat was gone. The poor man was in his shirt sleeves, and out of doors it was snowing.
"And the coat, Papa?"
"I have sold it."
"Why did you sell it?"
"Because I found it too hot." Pinocchio understood this answer in an instant, and unable to restrain the impulse of his good heart, he sprang up, and throwing his arms round Geppetto's neck, he began kissing him again and again. Chapter 9. As soon as it had done snowing, Pinocchio set out for school with his fine spelling book under his arm. As he went along, he began to imagine 1,000 things in his little brain, and to build 1,000 castles in the air, one more beautiful than the other. And talking to himself, he said, "Today at school I will learn to read at once. Then tomorrow I will begin to write, and the day after tomorrow to cipher. Then with my acquirements I will earn a great deal of money. And with the first money I have in my pocket I will immediately buy for my papa a beautiful new cloth coat. But what am I saying? Cloth indeed! It shall be all made of gold and silver, and it shall have diamond buttons. That poor man really deserves it, for to buy me books and have taught me he has remained in his shirt sleeves, and in this cold. It is only fathers who are capable of such sacrifices." Whilst he was saying this with great emotion, he thought that he heard music in the distance that sounded like flutes and the beating of a big drum. Fee, 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 zoom, 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 zoom. He stopped and listened. The sounds came from the end of a cross street that took to the end of a little village on the seashore. "What can that music be? It is a pity that I have to go to school, or else—" and he remained irresolute. It was, however, necessary to come to a decision. Should he go to school, or should he go after the flutes? "Today I will go and hear the flutes, and tomorrow I will go to school." finally decided the young scapegrace, shrugging his shoulders. The more he ran, the nearer came the sounds of the flutes and the beating of the big drum. Fee, 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 zoom, 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 zoom. At last he found himself in the middle of a square quite full of people, who were all crowding round a building made of wood and canvas, and painted 1,000 colors.
"What is that building?"
asked Pinocchio, turning to a little boy who belonged to the place.
"Read the placard, it is all written, and then you will know." "I would read it willingly, but it so happens that today I don't know how to read." "Bravo, blockhead! Then I will read it to you. The writing on that placard, in those letters red as fire, is Great Marionette Theater."
"Has the play begun long?"
"It is beginning now."
"How much does it cost to go in?"
"4d."
Pinocchio, who was in a fever of curiosity, lost all control of himself, and without any shame he said to the little boy to whom he was talking, "Would you lend me 4d until tomorrow?"
"I would lend them to you willingly," said the other, taking him off. "But it so happens that today I cannot give them to you." "I will sell you my jacket for 4d," the puppet then said to him. "What do you think that I could go with a jacket of flowered paper? If there was rain and it got wet, it would be impossible to get it off my back." "Will you buy my shoes?"
"They would only be of use to light the fire."
"How much will you give me for my cap?"
"That would be a wonderful acquisition indeed. A cap of breadcrumb. There would be a risk of the mice coming to eat it whilst it was on my head." Pinocchio was on thorns. He was on the point of making another offer, but he had not the courage. He hesitated, felt irresolute and remorseful. At last he said, "Will you give me 4d for this new spelling book?" "I'm a boy, and I don't buy from boys," replied his little interlocutor, who had much more sense than he had. "I will buy the spelling book for 4d," called out a peddler of old clothes who had been listening to the conversation. And the book was sold there and then. And to think that poor Geppetto had remained at home trembling with cold in his shirt sleeves, that he might buy his son a spelling book. Chapter 10. When Pinocchio came into the little marionette theater, an incident occurred that almost produced a revolution. I must tell you that the curtain was drawn up, and the play had already begun. On the stage, Harlequin and Pulcinello were as usual quarreling with each other, and threatening every moment to come to blows. The audience, all attention, laughed till they were ill as they listened to the bickerings of these two puppets, who gesticulated and abused each other so naturally that they might have been two reasonable beings and two persons of the world. All at once Harlequin stopped short, and turning to the public, he pointed with his hand to someone far down in the pits, and exclaimed in a dramatic tone, "Gods of the firmament, do I dream or am I awake? But surely that is Pinocchio!" "It is indeed Pinocchio!" cried Pulcinello. "It is indeed himself!" screamed Signora Rizzara, peeping from behind the scenes. "It is Pinocchio! It is Pinocchio!" shouted all the puppets in chorus, leaping from all sides of the stage. "It is Pinocchio! It is our brother Pinocchio! Long live Pinocchio!" "Pinocchio, come up here to me!" cried Harlequin, "and throw yourself into the arms of your wooden brothers." At this affectionate invitation, Pinocchio made a leap from the end of the pit into the reserved seats. Another leap landed him on the head of the leader of the orchestra, and he then sprang upon the stage. The embraces, the hugs, the friendly pinches, and the demonstrations of warm brotherly affection that Pinocchio received from the excited crowd of actors and actresses of the puppet dramatic company beat description. The sight was doubtless a moving one, but the public in the pit, finding that the play was stopped, became impatient and began to shout, "We will have the play! Go on with the play!" It was all breath thrown away. The puppets, instead of continuing the recital, redoubled their noise and outcries, and putting Pinocchio on their shoulders, they carried him in triumph before the footlights. At that moment, out came the showman. He was very big, and so ugly that the sight of him was enough to frighten anyone. His beard was as black as ink, and so long that it reached from his chin to the ground. I need only say that he trod upon it when he walked. His mouth was as big as an oven, and his eyes were like two lanterns of red glass, with lights burning inside them. He carried a large whip made of snakes and foxes' tails twisted together, which he cracked constantly.
At his unexpected appearance there was a profound silence. No one dared to breathe. A fly might have been heard in the stillness. The poor puppets of both sexes trembled like so many leaves.
"Why have you come to raise a disturbance in my theater?"
asked the showman to Pinocchio, in the gruff voice of a hobgoblin suffering from a severe cold in the head. "Believe me, honored sir, that it was not my fault."
"That is enough. Tonight we will settle our accounts."
As soon as the play was over, the showman went into the kitchen where Fine Sheep, preparing for supper, was turning slowly on the spit in front of the fire. As there was not enough wood to finish roasting and browning it, he called Harlequin and Pulcinello, and said to them,
"Bring that puppet here. You will find him hanging on a nail. It seems to me that he is made of very dry wood, and I am sure that if he was thrown on the fire, he would make a beautiful blaze for the roast."
At first Harlequin and Pulcinello hesitated, but appalled by a severe glance from their master, they obeyed. In a short time they returned to the kitchen, carrying poor Pinocchio, who was wriggling like an eel taken out of water, and screaming desperately, "Papa! Papa, save me! I will not die! I will not die!" Chapter 11. The showman, Fire Eater, for that was his name, looked, I must say, a terrible man, especially with his black beard that covered his chest and legs like an apron. On the whole, however, he had not a bad heart. And proof of this, when he saw poor Pinocchio brought before him, struggling and screaming, "I will not die! I will not die!" he was quite moved and felt very sorry for him. He tried to hold out, but after a little he could stand it no longer, and he sneezed violently. When he heard the sneeze, Harlequin, who up to that moment had been in the deepest affliction, bowed down like a weeping willow, became quite cheerful, and leaning towards Pinocchio, he whispered him softly, "Good news, brother. The showman has sneezed, and that is a sign that he pities you, and consequently you are saved." For you must know that whilst most men, when they feel compassion for somebody, either weep or at least pretend to dry their eyes, Fire Eater, on the contrary, whenever he was really overcome, had the habit of sneezing. After he had sneezed, the showman, still acting the ruffian, shouted to Pinocchio,
"Have done crying. Your lamentations have given me a pain in my stomach. I feel a spasm that almost... Achoo! Achoo!"
And he sneezed again twice. "Bless you," said Pinocchio.
"Thank you. And your papa and mamma, are they still alive?" asked Fire Eater.
"Papa, yes. My mamma I have never known."
"Who can say what a sorrow it would be for your poor father if he is to have thrown you amongst those burning coals? Poor old man! I compassionate him." Achoo! Achoo! Achoo!
And he sneezed again 3 times. "Bless you," said Pinocchio.
"Thank you. All the same, some compassion is due to me. For as you see, I have no more wood with which to finish roasting my mutton. And to tell you the truth, under the circumstances, you would have been of great use to me. However, I have had pity on you, so I must have patience. Instead of you, I will burn under the spit one of the marionettes belonging to my company. Ho there, gendarmes!"
At this call 2 wooden gendarmes immediately appeared. They are very tall and very thin, and had on crooked hats, and held unsheathed swords in their hands. The showman said to them in a hoarse voice, "Take Harlequin, bind him securely, and throw him on the fire to burn. I am determined that my mutton shall be well roasted." Only imagine that poor Harlequin. His face was so great that his legs bent under him, and he fell with his face on the ground. At this agonizing sight, Pinocchio, weeping bitterly, threw himself at the showman's feet, and breathing his long beard with his tears, he began to say in a supplicating voice, "Have pity, Sir Fire Eater!"
"Here there are no sirs,"
the showman answered severely. "Have pity, Sir Knight!"
"Here there are no knights."
"Have pity, Commander!"
"Here there are no commanders."
"Have pity, Excellence!" Upon hearing himself called excellence, the showman began to smile, became at once kinder and more tractable. Turning to Pinocchio, he asked,
"Well, what do you want from me?"
"I implore you to pardon poor Harlequin."
"For him there can be no pardon. As I have spared you, he must be put on the fire. For I am determined that my mutton shall be well roasted."
"In that case," cried Pinocchio proudly, rising and throwing away his cap of breadcrumb, "in that case I know my duty. Come on, gendarmes, bind me and throw me against the flames. No, it is not just that poor Harlequin, my true friend, should die for me." These words, pronounced in a loud heroic voice, made all the puppets who were present cry. Even the gendarmes, although they were made of wood, wept like two nearly born lambs. Fire Eater at first remained as hard and unmoved as ice, but little by little he began to melt and to sneeze. And having sneezed 4 or 5 times, he opened his arms affectionately and said to Pinocchio,
"You are a good, brave boy. Come here and give me a kiss."
Pinocchio ran at once, and climbing a squirrel up to the showman's beard, he deposited a hearty kiss on the point of his nose. "Then the pardon is granted?" asked poor Harlequin in a faint voice that was scarcely audible.
"The pardon is granted," answered
Fire Eater. He then added, sighing and shaking his head,
"I must have patience. Tonight I shall have to resign myself to eat the mutton half raw. But another time, woe to him who chances."
At the news of the pardon, the puppets all ran to the stage, and having lighted the lamps and chandeliers as if for a full-dress performance, they began to leap and to dance merrily. At dawn, they were still dancing. Chapter 12. The following day, Fire Eater called Pinocchio on one side and asked him,
"What is your father's name?"
"Geppetto."
"And what trade does he follow?"
"He is a beggar."
"Does he gain much?"
"Gain much? Why, he never has a penny in his pocket. Only think, to buy a spelling book for me to go to school, he was obliged to sell the only coat he had to wear, a coat that, between patches and darns, he was not fit to be seen."
"Poor devil! I feel almost sorry for him. Here are 5 gold pieces. Go at once and take them to him, with my compliments."
You can easily understand that Pinocchio thanked the showman 1,000 times. He embraced all the puppets of the company one by one, even to the gendarmes, and beside himself with delight set out to return home. But he had not gone far when he met on the road a fox lame of one foot, and a cat blind of both eyes, who were going along helping each other like good companions in misfortune. The fox, who was lame, walked leaning on the cat, and the cat, who was blind, was guided by the fox.
"Good day, Pinocchio," said the fox, accosting him politely.
"How do you come to know my name?" asked the puppet.
"I know your father well."
"Where did you see him?"
"I saw him yesterday at the door of his house."
"And what was he doing?"
"He was in his shirt sleeves, and shivering with cold."
"Poor papa! But that is over. For his future he shall shiver no more."
"Why?"
"Because I have become a gentleman."
"A gentleman? You?"
said the fox, and he began to laugh rudely and scornfully. The cat also began to laugh, but to conceal it he combed his whiskers with his forepaws. "There's little to laugh at," cried Pinocchio angrily. "I am really sorry to make your mouths water, but if you know anything about it, you can see that these here are 5 gold pieces." And he pulled out the money that Fire Eater had made him a present of. At the sympathetic ring of the money, the fox, with an involuntary movement, stretched out the paw that had seemed crippled, and the cat opened wide 2 eyes that looked like green lanterns. It is true that he shut them again, and so quickly that Pinocchio observed nothing.
"And now," said the fox, "what are you going to do with all that money?"
"First of all," answered the puppet, "I intend to buy a new coat for my papa, made of gold and silver, and with diamond buttons, and then I will buy a spelling book for myself."
"For yourself?"
"Yes, indeed, and I wish to go to school to study in earnest."
"Look at me," said the fox.
"Through my foolish passion for study, I have lost a leg."
"Look at me," said the cat.
"Through my foolish passion for study, I have lost the sight of both my eyes." At that moment a white blackbird that was perched on the hedge by the road began his usual song and said, "Pinocchio, don't listen to the advice of bad companions. If you do, you will repent it. Poor Blackbird! If only he had not spoken. The cat, with a great leap, sprang upon him, and without even giving him time to say, "Oh!" ate him in a mouthful, feathers and all. Having eaten him and cleaned his mouth, he shut his eyes again and feigned blindness as before. "Poor Blackbird," said Pinocchio to the cat. "Why did you treat him so badly?" "I did it to give him a lesson. He'll learn another time not to meddle in other people's conversation." They had gone almost halfway when the fox, halting suddenly, said to the puppet, "Would you like to double your money?" "In what way?" "Would you like to make out of your 5 miserable sovereigns 100, 1,000, 2,000?" "I should think so. But in what way?" "The way is easy enough. Instead of returning home, you must go with us." "And where would you wish to take me?" "To the land of the owls." Pinocchio reflected a moment, and then he said resolutely, "No, I will not go. I am already close to the house, and I will return home to my papa, who is waiting for me. Who can tell how often that poor man must have sighed yesterday when I did not come back? I have indeed been a bad son, and the talking cricket was right when he said disobedient boys never come to any good in the world. I have found it to my cost, for many misfortunes have happened to me. Even yesterday in Fire Eater's house I ran the risk. Oh, it makes me shudder only to think of it." "Well, then," said the fox, "you are quite decided to go home? Go, then, and so much the worse are you." "So much the worse are you," repeated the cat. "Think well of it, Pinocchio, for you are giving a kick to fortune." "To fortune," repeated the cat. "Between today and tomorrow your 5 sovereigns would have become 2,000. 2,000, repeated the cat. "But how is it possible that they could have become so many?" asked Pinocchio, remaining with his mouth open from astonishment. "I will explain it to you at once," said the fox. "You must know that in the land of the owls there is a sacred field called by everybody the Field of Miracles. In this field you must dig a little hole, and you put into it, we will say, 1 gold sovereign. You then cover up the hole with a little earth. You must water it with 2 pails of water from the fountain. Then sprinkle it with 2 pinches of salt, and when night comes, you can go quietly to bed. In the meanwhile, during the night, the gold piece will grow and flower. And in the morning, when you get up and return to the field, what do you find? You find a beautiful tree laden with as many gold sovereigns as a fine ear of corn has grains in the mouth of June." "So that," said Pinocchio, becoming more and more bewildered, "supposing I buried my 5 sovereigns in that field, how many should I find there the following morning?" "That is an exceedingly easy calculation," replied the fox, "a calculation that you can make on the ends of your fingers. Put that every sovereign gives you an increase of 500. Multiply 500 by 5, and the following morning you will find you with 2,500 shining gold pieces in your pocket." "Oh, how delightful!" cried Pinocchio, dancing for joy. "As soon as ever I have obtained these sovereigns, I will keep 2,000 for myself, and the other 500 I will make present of to you 2. "A present to us?" cried the fox with indignation and appearing much offended. "What are you dreaming of?" "What are you dreaming of?" repeated the cat. "We do not work," said the fox, "for dirty interest. We work solely to enrich others." "Others," repeated the cat. "What good people!" thought Pinocchio to himself, and forgetting there and then his papa, the new coat, the spelling book, and all his good resolutions, he said to the fox and cat, "Let us be off at once. I will go with you." Chapter 13. They walked and walked and walked, until at last, towards evening, they arrived dead tired at the Inn of the Red Crawfish. "Let us stop here a little," said the fox, "that we may have something to eat and rest ourselves for an hour or 2. We must start again at midnight, so as to arrive at the Field of Miracles by dawn tomorrow morning." Having gone into the inn, they all 3 sat down to table, but none of them had any appetite. The cat, who was suffering from indigestion and feeling seriously indisposed, could only eat 35 mullet with tomato sauce, and 4 portions of tripe with Parmesan cheese. and because he thought the tripe was not seasoned enough, he asked 3 times for the butter and grated cheese. The fox would also willingly have picked a little, but as his doctor had ordered him a strict diet, he was forced to content himself with simply a hare dressed with a sweet and sour sauce, and garnished lightly with fat chickens and early pellets. After the hare, he sent for a made dish of partridges, rabbits, frogs, lizards, and other delicacies. He could not touch anything else. He had such a disgust of food, he said, that he could put nothing to his lips. The one who ate the least was Pinocchio. He asked for some walnuts and a hunch of bread, and left everything on his plate. The poor boy, whose thoughts were continually fixed on the field of miracles, had got an anticipation and indigestion of gold pieces. When they had supped, the fox said to the host, "Give us 2 good rooms, one for Mr. Pinocchio and the other for me and my companion. We will snatch a little sleep before we leave. Remember, however, that at midnight we wish to be called to continue our journey." "Yes, gentlemen," answered the host, and he winked at the fox and cat as much as to say, "I know what you are up to. We understand one another." No sooner had Pinocchio got into bed than he fell asleep at once and began to dream. And he dreamt that he was in the middle of a field, and the field was full of shrubs covered with clusters of gold sovereigns, and as they swung in the wind, they went zin, 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 almost as if they would say, "Let who will come and take us." But when Pinocchio was at the most interesting moment, that is, just as he was stretching out his hand to pick handfuls of those beautiful gold pieces and to put them in his pocket, he was suddenly wakened by 3 violent blows on the door of his room. It was the host, who had come to tell him that midnight had struck. "Are my companions ready?" asked the puppet. "Ready? Why, they left 2 hours ago." "Why were they in such a hurry?" "Because the cat received a message to say that his eldest kitten was ill with chilblains on his feet, and was in danger of death." "Did they pay for the supper?" "What are you thinking of? They are much too well educated to dream of offering such an insult to a gentleman like you." "What a pity! It is an insult that would have given me so much pleasure," said Pinocchio, scratching his head. He then asked, "And where did my good friends say they would wait for me?" "At the Field of Miracles, tomorrow morning at daybreak." Pinocchio paid a sovereign for his supper and that of his companions, and then left. Outside the inn it was so pitch dark that he had almost to grope his way, for it was impossible to see a hand's breadth in front of him. In the adjacent country not a leaf moved. Only some night birds flying across the road from one hedge to the other brushed Pinocchio's nose with their wings as they passed, which caused him so much terror that, springing back, he shouted, "Who goes there?" And the echo in the surrounding hills repeated in the distance, "Who goes there? Who goes there? Who goes there?" As he was walking along, he saw a little insect shining dimly on the trunk of a tree, like a nightlight in a lamp of transparent china. "Who are you?" asked Pinocchio. "I am the ghost of the talking cricket," answered the insect in a low voice, so weak and faint that it seemed to come from the other world. "What do you want with me?" said the puppet. "I want to give you some advice. Go back and take the 4 sovereigns that you have left to your poor father, who is weeping in despair because you have never returned to him. By tomorrow my papa will be a gentleman, for these 4 sovereigns will have become 2,000. Don't trust, my boy, to those who promise to make you rich in a day. Usually they are either mad or rogues. Give ear to me, and go back. On the contrary, I am determined to go on. The hour is late. I am determined to go on. The night is dark. I am determined to go on. The road is dangerous. I am determined to go on. Remember that boys who are bent on following their caprices, and will have their own way, sooner or later repent it. Always the same stories. Good night, Cricket." "Good night, Pinocchio, and may heaven preserve you from dangers and from assassins." No sooner he said these words than the talking cricket vanished suddenly like a light that has been blown out, and the road became darker than ever. Chapter 14. "Really," said the puppet to himself as he resumed his journey, "how unfortunate we poor boys are. Everybody scolds us, everybody admonishes us, everybody gives us good advice. To let them talk, they would all take it to their heads to be our fathers and our masters. All, even the talking cricket. See now, because I don't choose to listen to that tiresome cricket, who knows, according to him, how many misfortunes are to happen to me? I'm even to meet with assassins. That is, however, of little consequence, for I don't believe in assassins. I've never believed in them. For me, I think that assassins have been invented purposely by papas to frighten boys who want to go out at night. Besides, supposing I was to come across them here in the road, do you imagine they would frighten me? Not the least in the world. I should go to meet them and cry, 'Gentlemen assassins, what do you want with me?' Remember that with me there is no joking. Therefore go about your business and be quiet." At this speech, said in a determined tone, those poor assassins, I think I see them, would run away like the wind. If, however, they are so badly educated as not to run away, why then I would run away myself, and there would be an end of it. But Pinocchio had not time to finish his reasoning, for at that moment he thought he heard a slight rustle of leaves behind him. He turned to look, and saw in the gloom two evil-looking black figures completely enveloped in charcoal sacks. They were running after him on tiptoe, making great leaps like two phantoms. "Here they are in reality," he said to himself, and not knowing where to hide his gold pieces, he put them in his mouth precisely under his tongue. Then he tried to escape, but he had not gone a step when he felt himself seized by the arm, and two horrid voices said to him, "Your money or your life!" Pinocchio, not being able to answer in words, owing to the money that was in his mouth, made 1,000 low bows and 1,000 pantomimes. He tried thus to make the two muffled figures, whose eyes were only visible through the holes in their sacks, understand that he was a poor puppet, and that he had not as much as a false farthing in his pocket. "Come now, less nonsense, and out with the money!" cried the two brigands threateningly. And the puppet made a gesture with his hands to signify, "I have got none." "Deliver up your money, or you are dead," said the tallest of the brigands. "Dead," repeated the other. "And after we have killed you, we also will kill your father." "Also your father." "No, no, no, not my poor papa!" cried Pinocchio in a disappearing tone. And as he said it, the sovereigns clinked in his mouth. "Ah, you rascal! Then you have hidden your money under your tongue! Spit it out at once!" But Pinocchio was obdurate. "Ah, you pretend to be deaf, do you? Wait a moment. Leave it to us to find a means to make you spit it out." And one of them seized the puppet by the end of his nose, and the other took him by the chin and began to pull them brutally, the one up and the other down, to constrain him to open his mouth. But it was all to no purpose. Pinocchio's mouth seemed to have been nailed and riveted together. Then the shorter assassin drew out an ugly knife, and tried to force it between his lips like a lever, or chisel. But Pinocchio, as quick as lightning, caught his hand with his teeth, and with one bite bit it clean off and spat it out. Imagine his astonishment, when instead of a hand, he perceived that he had spat a cat's paw onto the ground. Encouraged by this first victory, he used his nails to such purpose that he succeeded in liberating himself from his assailants, and jumping the hedge by the roadside, he began to fly across the country. The assassins ran after him like two dogs chasing a hare, and the one who had lost a paw ran on one leg, and no one ever knew how he managed it. After a race of some miles, Pinocchio could do no more. Giving himself up for lost, he climbed to the stem of a very high pine tree and seated himself in the topmost branches. The assassins attempted to climb after him. When they had reached halfway up the stem, they slid down again, and arrived on the ground with the skin grazed from their hands and knees. But they were not to be beaten by so little. Collecting a quantity of dry wood, they piled it beneath the tree and set fire to it. In less time than it takes to tell, the pine began to burn and to flame like a candle, blown by the wind. Pinocchio, seeing that the flames were mounting higher every instant, and not wishing to end his life like a roasted pigeon, made a stupendous jump from the top of the tree, and started afresh across the fields and vineyards. The assassins followed him, and kept behind him without giving once in. The day began to break, and they were still pursuing him. Suddenly Pinocchio found his way barred by a wide, deep ditch full of dirty water the color of coffee. What was he to do? "1, 2, 3!" cried the puppet, and making a rush, he sprang to the other side. The assassins also jumped, but not having measured the distance properly. Splash! Splash! They fell into the very middle of the ditch. Pinocchio, who heard the plunge and the splashing of the water, shouted out laughing without stopping, "A fine bath to you, gentlemen assassins!" and he felt convinced that they were drowned, when, turning to look, he perceived that on the contrary they were both running after him, still enveloped in their sacks, with the water dripping from them as if they had been two hollow baskets. Chapter 15. At this sight the puppet's courage failed him, and he was on the point of throwing himself on the ground, and giving himself over for lost. Turning, however, his eyes in every direction, he saw at some distance, standing out amidst the dark green of the trees, a small house as white as snow. "If I had only breath to reach that house," he said to himself, "perhaps I should be saved." And without delaying an instant, he recommenced running for his life through the wood, and the assassins after him. At last, after a desperate race of nearly 2 hours, he arrived quite breathless at the door of the house, and knocked. No one answered. He knocked again with great violence, for he heard the sound of steps approaching him, and the heavy panting of his persecutors. The same silence. Seeing that knocking was useless, he began in desperation to kick and pummel the door with all his might. The window then opened, and a beautiful little girl appeared at it. She had blue hair and a face as white as a waxen image. Her eyes were closed, and her hands were crossed on her breast. Without moving her lips in the least, she said in a voice that seemed to come from the other world, "In this house there is no one. They are all dead." "Then at least open the door for me yourself," shouted Pinocchio, crying and imploring. "I am dead also." "Dead? Then what are you doing there at the window?" "I'm waiting for the coffin to come and carry me away." Having said this, she immediately disappeared, and the window was closed again without the slightest noise. "Oh, beautiful little girl with blue hair!" cried Pinocchio. "Open the door for pity's sake! Have compassion on a poor boy pursued by his aunt!" But he could not finish the word, for he felt himself seized by the collar, and the same two horrible voices said to him threateningly, "You shall not escape from us again." The puppet, seeing death staring him in the face, was taken with such a violent fit of trembling that the joints of his wooden legs began to creak, and the sovereigns hidden under his tongue began to clink. "Now then," demanded the assassins, "will you open your mouth? Yes or no? Ah, no answer. Leave it to us. This time we will force you to open it." And drawing out two long horrid knives as sharp as razors, clash! They attempted to stab him twice, but the puppet, luckily for him, was made of very hard wood, and the knives therefore broke into 1,000 pieces, and the assassins were left at the handles and their hands staring at each other. "I see what we must do," said one of them. "He must hang. Let us hang him." "Let us hang him," repeated the other. Without loss of time, they tied his arms behind him, passed a running noose round his throat, and then hung him to the branch of a tree called the Big Oak. Then they sat down on the grass and waited for his last struggle. But at the end of 3 hours, the puppet's eyes were still open, his mouth closed, and he was kicking more than ever. Losing patience, they turned to Pinocchio and said in a bantering tone, "Goodbye till tomorrow. Let us hope that when you return, you will be polite enough to allow yourself to be found quite dead and with your mouth wide open." And they walked off. In the meantime, a tempestuous northerly wind began to blow and roar angrily, and it beat the poor puppet as he hung from side to side, making him swing violently like the clatter of a bell ringing for a wedding. And the swinging gave him atrocious spasms, and the running noose, becoming still tighter round his throat, took away his breath. Little by little his eyes began to grow dim, but although he felt that death was near, he still continued to hope that some charitable person would come to his assistance before it was too late. But when, after waiting and waiting, he found that no one came, absolutely no one, then he remembered his poor father, and thinking he was dying, he stammered out, "Oh, Papa, Papa, if only you were here." His breath failed him, and he could say no more. He shut his eyes, opened his mouth, stretched his legs, gave a long shudder, and hung stiff and insensible.